Hi, thank you for tuning into Facebook Live to hear my family story. My name is Ron Coppel, and I am the child of Holocaust survivors. Um, it was about, I guess, a year or so ago, I had a doctor's appointment. It was the first time to visit this doctor. And as you all know, you go to a doctor first time, what do? They give you a clipboard and a pen, and they sit you in the waiting room, and they say, fill this out. And this doctor had a lot of forms to fill out. And I go through them. In the middle of the pack was one I'd never seen before. Picture a sheet of paper, left-hand column, and it listed all relatives: father, mother, paternal grandfather, paternal grandmother, maternal grandfather. You get the idea, all the way down, aunts, uncles. On the right-hand column was blank. And at the top of the column it said, if deceased, cause of death, for me to fill in. Take the pen and I get down to paternal grandfather. What do I put for cause of death? What do I put? I stared at it. And finally, pen in hand, I wrote down murdered. Paternal grandmother, murdered. Maternal grandfather, murdered. That is why I'm here to tell the story of my family. I am Ron Coppel. This is my family story. So the story begins. Dad was born into a middle-class family in Merse, Germany. That's my dad on the slide there. There we go. That's my dad. And then also he was born in Merse. Merse is a small town in Germany. There's a map here. The nearest big city is Dusseldorf, as you can see it up in the corner. Middle-class family. This is a slide of my grandfather, my grandparents. That's my grandfather. His name was Karl Coppel. He was a World War I veteran, highly decorated, wounded, earned the Iron Cross, walked with a limp for the rest of his life, was captured. He was a prisoner of war in France. My grandmother, Gudula Coppel, and my dad is on the left, and my uncle Gunther is on the right. So life in Germany in a small middle-class town. Go ahead, back to me. Go back to me. So life in the Germany in the small middle-class town was normal. You know, for the first 10 years, Dad went to school. He went to play soccer with the kids in the neighborhood. It was very normal until he was 10 years old, and that would have been in 1938, the first of the laws that were designed to separate the Jews from the rest of Germany, called the Nuremberg laws. Let me share just a thought with you here. Hitler had a role model. He knew how to separate, how he could separate the Jews from the rest of society. His role model? The Jim Crow laws in the southern United States were Hitler's role model. And I can't go through all of the Nuremberg laws, too many of them to go through, but they stripped the Jews of their citizenship, number one. After the Nuremberg laws passed, then it started with the signs that were in the public parks and the restaurants. No Jews or dogs allowed. Dad was kicked out of school. The community was just, the Jewish community just took a ramshackle building and created a one-room schoolhouse from high school all the way down. And it really, that's when things got, Dad's friends would no longer play with him, etc. I'm going to fast forward now to when he was 13 years old. That would have been in February of 1938. Dad's bar mitzvah. And all of you know what a bar mitzvah is by now. And of course, for girls now, we do bat mitzvahs. But if you've ever been to one, the Jewish boy, the 13-year-old boy, is in front of the congregation. That town had one synagogue in the whole town. So the community was there. And the bar mitzvah boy, as we like to say, reads from his portion from the Torah. But the Nazis knew. They knew that the Jews were all gathered in that synagogue on that Saturday morning. So they marched outside and they stopped in front of there and they sang their songs so that everybody inside could hear through the windows. And I'll give you the translation of what my dad heard while he was trying to read his portion of the Torah. When Jew blood spurts from our knives, life will be twice as good. That was in February of 38. Same year, November 9th, that synagogue was burned along with 1,400 other synagogues. The slide on burn was 1,400 synagogues were burned along with it. They ransacked it, they desecrated, they tore up the Torahs, they went into stores, they busted up stores' windows, looted the stores, they ripped kids out of orphanages and made them kneel on the street on November 9th in November weather and tore up and ransacked the orphanage. Kristallnacht, that's the name it got, because crystal is the German word for broken glass. And there was so much broken glass on the streets. Go back to me. There was so much broken glass on the streets that it got the name Kristallnacht. The history, the historical context of Kristallnacht in terms of the Holocaust, Kristallnacht was the beginning of the end and the end of the beginning. February of 1940, Dad left home and he joined a group called Hakshara. It was it was a Zionist youth organization. The idea was that the Jewish leaders in Germany realized they had to get their kids out of Germany as best they could. So Dad described it kind of Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, a little bit of 4-H club, because they taught them, how to farm. The idea was to get them to Palestine, get them out of Germany for their safety. My readings, I've learned that one Hakshara group did make it to Palestine, but Dad's organization did not. I think out of the 40-some kids, from what I recall Dad saying, about 6 survived. That lasted 1 year. And Dad described it at that point in his life, that was the best year of his life, but it only lasted 1 year. Because in 1941, Dad and the entire Hakshara group was arrested. That's when the famous edict came out. All Jews had to wear that yellow star on their outer clothing. But at that point, Dad got a message from home back in Merce. His parents and his brother had orders of deportation. And as you well may know, the deportation, the idea was they now ordered Jews to get out of Germany. And I pictured this in this small town, back to me, I picture in this small town that, all the Jews in that town with those big yellow stars on their outer garment had to show up with a suitcase and had to stand in line to get on the train. Everybody in town had to see it. But if you would ask anybody afterwards, they didn't see anything. Dad was fond of saying, before 1945, he never met a German who was not a Nazi. After 1945, he never met a German that was. So he went back to Merce, and he when he got there, he actually went to the Gestapo office, and he asked permission to be deported with his parents, and that was denied. So he said goodbye to them, and he never saw them again. But he did learn many, many years later from others that he met, actually at the reunion, Holocaust survivors reunion in Jerusalem, filled him in on the stories of what happened. So when my grandparents and my uncle were deported, deported to Riga, which is the capital city of Latvia. And when they arrived there, they were told, it's a long walk from the train station where we're going. So what we should do is, if you can't walk, we have vans lined up for you. We'll give you a ride. And my grandfather, as I shared with you, was wounded in World War I and walked with a pretty severe limp. So as a result, I think he said, picture in my mind that he said, to his wife, my grandmother, you walk, I'll meet you at the destination. Those vans, exhaust pipes were hooked up around. They were mobile gas chambers. So they drove my grandfather and the other passengers around until they were all dead. We don't know we know what happened inside the ghettos. That's well documented. I don't know what happened specifically, life for my grandmother and my uncle. And he was I think about 9 or 10 years old at that point. But we do know, again, from others who told my dad, at one point there was an order that came out for all the children to be sent to a different location. And that my grandmother then volunteered to go with the children. I'm assuming because she wanted to stay with her son. We do know from the records that those children from Riga went directly to Auschwitz. And we do know from the records that immediately upon arrival, they went, in the language of Auschwitz, they went up the chimney. Here's a picture of what the Riga ghetto looks like. It's actually a modern day picture of the building that the Riga ghetto looks like. Now back to Dad, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Dad, in April of 43, the Hakshara group got arrested and they were put on the proverbial trains. Now they were initially put on actually open coal cars, and then eventually into the infamous cattle cars. And they also used box cars. They used whatever cars they could get to move these people. And if you know what life was like, saw the movie Schindler's List or other readings, they jammed people in those cars like you wouldn't believe. Those cars were meant for 15 cows, and they jammed 90 people to 100 people in there. And if the door didn't close, the Gestapo officer took out his pistol, shot a few people, they fell out, and by golly, then the door closed. And people were crammed in there so tight and so hard. And in the summer, it could be 120 degrees in there, could be days journey, bathrooms, they had a bucket. Like you could really get to it, right? And no water and no food, and people were crying and hurting. And if the person next to you died, you held up the dead person. And if a young mother had a baby and the baby died, she just had to carry her dead baby. But then they arrived in Auschwitz. And, again, many of you have read the selection process, to the left, to the right, thumbs up, thumbs down. But the Hakshara group were young, strong teenagers. So they got to go to the right. They were not sent to the gas chambers. And I need to take 1 minute to describe Auschwitz for you. It's not a place. It was actually 3 large camps and a lot of small satellite working camps, all these factory working camps. Auschwitz I, the original camp, had a gas chamber, but it was too small to kill people fast enough. Auschwitz II is called Birkenau, and that was the killing place. That had the big gas chambers and the big ovens. But there was an Auschwitz III near a town of Monowitz, and it had a nickname Buna. And Buna is actually the German word for liquefied gas. And this was a giant factory. There were 1,000 slave laborers working in this factory. And the factory was not run by the Nazi government. No, the factory was run by a corporation that has stockholders, shareholders, board of directors, a for-profit. The name of that corporation was IG Farben. And they made a lot of different products. Allow me to mention one. Bear aspirin. Yes, the same Bear aspirin that you buy in Walgreens and CVS today, back then, not today, but back then was made by IG Farben. And they paid the German government for the slaves, for profit. And Dad was there. And by the way, if you've read Dr. Elie Wiesel's book, Night, he was also in Buna. In fact, Dad met Elie Wiesel in Cincinnati many years later, and they compared notes and discovered they didn't know each other in camp, but they discovered Dr. Wiesel's barracks was directly behind my dad's barracks. But Dad was there for 22 months. 22 months of deprivation, of torture, of selection processes, of having to assemble every night to watch the meting out of the punishments of the day, which included hangings. I mean, just unbelievable. He did not talk very much about the torture and the beatings and that. He did speak about the pervasive hunger. But now I'm going to the fact that the Germans are losing the war. And so they go, and go to the next slide, to that infamous death march. Go next one. And that, again, Elie Wiesel's book, Night, really describes it. There were 60,000, I believe, marched for that death march it was famous, but I'll describe a little bit about that death march. Dad would talk about the fact that he would hear gunfire in the back of the line. They knew what that was. They knew what that was. Back to me. They knew what that was. It was if anybody fell down, if anybody could not take another step, mercy shot in the back of the neck. But what scared them was the gunfire they heard at the front of the line, because they didn't know what that was. One of Dad's buddies said, I'm going to go up front and I'm going to see what's going on. I'll fall back and let you know, which he did. And when he fell back, he said, you know what? I think we're going to be okay. They're only shooting those who are trying to escape. They're only shooting those who are trying to run into, they're marching through the forest, running into the woods. And Dad says, I don't know what got into me. I told him years later, yeah, I do. It's called adrenaline. But he said, I looked to the left, I didn't see a guard. I looked to the right, I didn't see a guard. And he bolted into the woods. He could hear the bullets whiz by his ears as he ran, but thank God he was not hit. Got into the woods, and when he got into the woods, he met with two other guys. Didn't know them from before, they were older guys, but they had that Auschwitz striped uniform on. So these three guys, banded together, trying to survive. They found a hay stack and they ate hay. They were starving. Can you imagine that? But after about 3 days, they came upon a German farmhouse, simple, small farmhouse, banged on the door, demanded food, water, shelter, and told the farmer, you know, if you try to turn us in, we'll kill your family. But he was a simple guy. He gave him some food, water. They slept in the barn. But they could hear the war rolling over, coming on them, you know, the bombings and the explosions. And a couple of days later, a Russian tank pulls up to the farmhouse and imagine turns his turret to the farmhouse. I don't know why. I'm going to assume, you know, German farmhouse, Russian tank. But these three guys in those striped Auschwitz uniforms come out and stand in front of the tank with their hands up. I surrender. And they could hear that hatch on the top of the tank squeak open, and that Russian tank commander with that red star on top of his hat sticks his head out of that tank, peers down at those three guys, and addresses them in Yiddish, the Jewish language. He was a Jew and they were liberated. So he was chasing a German Panzer, German tank, and asked them, did you see that Panzer go by? Where did he go? What direction? And they said, yes, we did. And they were glad to help. He went that way. Then they said to him, which way should we go? And he said, you guys, you go that way. So they started walking that way and through the woods, and then eventually came to a town. The town is Gleiwitz. Got a map of that town to show you where it is. This is Gleiwitz. Now, if you look at this map, you see Gleiwitz is in Germany then. After the war, they realigned the borders. And today, this town is actually in Poland. But that's where they went to. Okay, come back to me. They were walking down the street. Now, they could walk down the street now. Let me just take a quick drink of water. They could walk down the street now because the Nazis were gone. The Russians are in charge. And two women are walking in the other direction. And these two women say to them, "We're Jewish. We can help you. There are a bunch of us live nearby," and points to where they live, like an apartment complex, if you will, a few buildings. We'll take you in. So I got to take a break here for 1 minute and say, hey, how is it that two Jewish women are walking down the street? Where do they come from? The answer is this. Part of that Nuremberg laws, one of those Nuremberg laws was Jews and Aryans. Aryans, as you know, is the white supremacy name that the Germans gave each other to themselves because they're so superior, don't you know? The Aryan and a Jew could not marry against the law. But of course, a lot of mixed marriages took place before the war. Mixed marriages, mixed children, right? And the Germans had a name for that. They call them Mischling, mixed race, mixed marriage. Local Gestapo officers throughout Germany, who were the ones in charge of determining who, when, and where Jews would be sent to the camps, had a choice. They could send a mixed marriage. They could take the Jewish partner. And keep in mind, the Jewish partner still had to suffer all the humilities and all the yellow star and all the junk that was imposed upon them. They could take the Jewish partner and send him to camp, or they could decide, as long as the Jewish partner and the mixed Jewish children lived under the roof of the Aryan partner, they weren't shipped out. Well, not then. Wouldn't know for the future, but at that time. One of the women was married to an Aryan, a non-Jew, a Gentile. And so she could live under his roof. She had all the humilities opposed upon her, but she could live under his roof. And she and her husband hid the other woman, her sister, in their apartment throughout the war. But now they could come down the street. And that neighborhood she was referring to was the neighborhood of the Mischling. They were segregated, all those mixed marriages, mixed children. So the three guys went there, but at this point, Dad was ill. Look, he weighed 90 pounds. He had a fever. So once he got there, they called a young woman who had previously been trained as a nurse and said, "What can you do for this guy?" And she knew what to do. She took a little sample of his saliva, took it to the hospital nearby. They put it under a microscope. It was nothing serious, but they gave her some meds, and she nursed my dad back to health. 67 years later, my dad took care of that nurse, my mom, as her life was slipping away. Let's take a look at a picture of my mom. I'll introduce you to her here. That's my mom in the background there, holding the baby. And the next slide will show you my maternal grandparents, my maternal family. So that's my maternal grandfather. His name was Jacob Silbermann. He was an electrician by profession, but being a Jew, he couldn't work at that. So they forced labored him into a railroad yard. But I need you to know that not all Nazis wore uniforms, because in his work railroad yard, one day a speeding freight train came down the tracks, and one of his co-workers pushed him in front of the train, killed him. And this is my imagination now. I don't know this, obviously. My imagination is, I picture that good German fella going home for dinner that night and sharing with his family what a great day he had at work. And then you saw my grandmother, her name, Elizabeth Silbermann, and she had converted to Judaism when she married my grandfather. And so as a result, she was, quote unquote, born an Aryan, and that's why they weren't sent away. And those are my uncles you saw on the left and my mom on the right. But they had to get out of Gleiwitz, because Gleiwitz was now in Poland. And I can tell you for a fact that no German wanted to be caught in a Polish city, and sure as heck no German Jew wanted to be caught in a Polish city. So everybody got the heck out of there, and they made their way to Berlin. In Berlin, we can go to the slide. My parents were the first Jewish wedding in Berlin after the war. There was with documents on that. There was a burgeoning Jewish newspaper, and they made that announcement. That would be in March 1946. Then, in January of 1948, slide, they had the cutest baby you can imagine. That's me. Now, this picture, I think, has a little bit of significance I want to talk about because my dad shared this with me. The post-war, the survivors, oh my gosh, my dad, 22 months of starvation and deprivation, others who weren't in camps, hiding in attics for years, hiding in the woods. There was a lot of trauma, and there was a lot of PTSD before anybody knew what PTSD was. And my dad was very angry and very bitter. But fortunately, what he said was, when I was born, he looked down at me and he thought to himself, I can't raise a son feeling like this. And for him, that was a catharsis. Well, the idea was, next slide, the idea was get to America. And they came on a ship, troop transport, the USS General McRae. Truman had signed laws that allowed the immigration of well, they weren't just survivors. I mean, a lot of Nazis snuck in on those ships also. We found that out many years later. But they did come, and I just want to, before we get to the next slide, I'll just share with you, Dad would talk about it. They had, the night before they landing into, disembarking into New York Harbor, they had warnings. So I picture my dad wearing the only suit that he had on deck, with my mother wearing probably her best dress, one suitcase with all their worldly possessions, $5 in his pocket, baby on my mom's hip, 18 months old. And they came into New York Harbor, and then they saw it slide. That's when they saw that Statue of Liberty. It was such a, I mean, my dad looked at that and just said, wow, leaving the blood-soaked soil of Europe behind. And that was a big deal. Do you have a slide of the statue? And then we can go, right, there's a statue. And you go on to the next slide. Cincinnati, Ohio, that's where we wound up. And my parents could not, by the way, the handsome young man next to me is my brother, Steve. He was born in Cincinnati. So between the two of us, he's the only one that was eligible to be elected president. My parents could not wait to become American citizens. They wanted to learn English as fast as they could. In fact, I speak very little German. You can come back to me. I speak very little German because the only time they ever spoke German was, when they didn't want Stephen and me to understand what they were trying to say to each other. But they couldn't wait to become citizens. They couldn't wait to vote in their first election. And they were now in America. But those early years, 1950s, 1960s, even into the 70s, nobody talked about the Holocaust. In fact, their friends, Jewish friends, would say to them, hey, we know you had it tough. We know that. But you're in America now. You're going to be okay. Get over it. You're fine. And besides, how do you explain what happened in Auschwitz to your kids? Can't. How do you explain that? So nothing was said, but that changed. That changed in 1978 with a NBC miniseries called Holocaust. Actually, for those of my age, you remember there was actually, I think a year before, a miniseries called Roots, and then the following year was Holocaust. We watched it. Now, Dad said, obviously, they couldn't really depict what it was like in Auschwitz. That would be impossible. But he was glad they told the story. It was good. But with that came out of the woodwork, out of the dark corners, came the Holocaust deniers. And in fact, here in Skokie, in Chicagoland, in Skokie, Illinois, they actually wanted, the neo-Nazi deniers wanted to do a parade down the main street of Skokie. And so, you know, Skokie was at the time a center for residents. A lot of Holocaust survivors were living in Skokie, and they wanted to do a parade. Now, they got the right to do a parade, United States, First Amendment. They never had the guts, not in Skokie, but that was the genesis of the Holocaust, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. That's when it started. And back to Cincinnati, Dad opens up the Cincinnati Enquirer, the local newspaper, and there's a letter to the editor. And it's from the head of the Cincinnati chapter of the German American Bund, whatever. And it specifically says, the Holocaust never happened. The Diary of Anne Frank is a hoax. And for Dad, for survivors everywhere in Skokie and Cincinnati, from San Francisco to New York, from Dallas to Minneapolis, everywhere, Jews, survivors said, oh my gosh, if we don't tell the story, who will? And that's when the beginning of many of these museums, large and small, across the country and even through the world, and Dad started speaking. And you can put the next slide there. Dad started speaking to schools. Dad started speaking everywhere he could, dozens of school libraries. He spoke at the Ohio State House. He spoke at the Ohio Penitentiary. Hopefully tell the difference. He spoke everywhere he could. He spoke with the FBI. He spoke with police academies, everywhere, to tell the story. And that's why I'm a docent at the Illinois Museum, and Steve is an interpreter at the Cincinnati Museum to this day, carrying that legacy. Go back to me. I want to share with you what I say when I do my presentations, because I take this from my dad. Elie Wiesel famously said, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference, and that we have to deal with indifference. And what I do is I ask the students when I'm making this presentation, I say to them, you are constantly being told to be an upstander, not a bystander. You don't need me to explain it to you because you hear it all the time. The question is, where, when, and how? Where can you be an upstander? How can you be an upstander? When can you be an upstander? And I say to them, I want a show of hands right now. I want you to raise your hands. And they're usually very shy about it. I have to really egg them on. How many of you ever have been in a conversation, maybe with a friend, maybe at home, and somebody said something anti-Semitic? Somebody said something racist, use the N-word. Somebody gay bashing, somebody bashing Muslim people, Hispanic people. Raise your hand. Come on, raise it. And eventually the hands go up. And then I tell the students, look around, look, everybody turn around, look around, because I'm telling you now, whenever this point is, I'm not going to tell you that 100% of the hands go up. I'm going to tell you 98 to 99% go up. So I want the kids to see that. Then I tell them to lower their hands. And I say to them, this is where you can be an upstander. You have to speak up. And I say, you can use your own words, but here's what my dad used to say. This is what I say. I say to that person when I hear that, I say, look, it's a free country. You can think anything you want. You can say anything you want, but not in front of me. I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to listen to it. It's wrong. And then you turn around and you walk away. But this is the where, this is the when, and this is the how you too can be an upstander. Final thought. Dr. Wiesel, Elie Wiesel, was once asked, and this is a quick picture of, that's Dr. Wiesel, that's my parents, come back to me. Dr. Wiesel was once asked, can a witness to the experience of the Holocaust be transferred from one person to another? And he said, yes. In fact, I'll give you the exact quote. He said, listening to a witness makes you a witness. So my parents telling the stories to me and to my brother made us witnesses. And what I share with my audience is I'll share with you right now. You being here and listening to my parents' stories makes each and every one of you witnesses to the Holocaust. And as I tell the students in my presentation, please carry that as you go forward with the rest of your life and what you learned here, and think about that as you think about how to treat the people you meet. Thank you. Sierra, if we have time, we can do some questions, some Q&A here, if you want to take over and help me out with that. Okay, so I'll hit this. Okay, so if anyone I should have mentioned earlier, if anyone had any questions, they could type it into the chat button early down below there. And if you don't have any questions, that's fine too, but we'll hold on for about 1 more minute and see if anyone has any questions they would like to ask. Just type it into chat. And okay, we're waiting for questions now. And if not, that's okay. I'll just go hold you 1 minute, and then I'm going to give you my close, if you will. All right, Sierra, I think I'll go ahead with the close. Thank you all again for tuning in. Join us here next Wednesday, that would be January 17th at 10 a.m., to hear Holocaust survivor Agnes Schwartz share her story. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during these extraordinary times. And with that, I say good day.